Well, hi there, and welcome back as we continue in our journey through the life of David together to learn what it was that made David a man after God's own heart. In Deep Down Dark, Hector Tobar tells the story of 33 Chilean miners who were trapped 2,000 feet below the surface for 69 days. They had to live in the dark with almost no food, cut off from the rest of the world. They didn't know if they would ever see daylight again. Many of the miners, face to face with imminent death, took stock of their lives and realized they had a lot of regrets. Somebody asked Jose Enriquez, a Christian, if he would pray for everyone. As he got down on his knees, some of the other men joined him and he began to talk to God. "We aren't the best men, Lord, but have pity on us." He actually got more specific. "Victor Segovia knows that he drinks too much. Victor Zamora is too quick to anger. Pedro Cortez thinks about the poor father he's been to his young daughter." Nobody objected. It was the beginning of something special. In the deep down dark, buried under the earth, with death staring them in the face, the men got real before God and each other. They met every day to eat a meager meal, hear a short sermon, and then get on their knees and pray. "God, forgive me for the violence of my voice before my wife and my son." Or, "God, forgive me for abusing the temple of my body with drugs." They confessed to each other too. "I'm sorry I raised my voice," or "I'm sorry I didn't help get the water." Meanwhile, above the surface, a rescue effort had begun. People from all over the world began trying to help or give or pray for the men to be saved. Unfortunately, the happiest part of the story is also the saddest. The drill cuts a narrow hole through the rock. The miners get food and supplies and iPads. They know that eventually they'll be rescued. They find out they're becoming famous and they might get rich. And then the confessing stops. The praying stops. The lure of money and fame undoes the transformative community that had developed in their shared suffering. They were at their best when life was at its worst. The deep down dark is the place where you know you can't make it on your own. The deep down dark is the place where you realize you need God. We pick up our story this morning. We find David is going through his own deep down dark. He is on the run from his father-in-law, King Saul, despite the fact that he's done nothing wrong. And we picked up our story with David, the young boy, who Samuel anoints as the next king of Israel and ordains as the next king of Israel. And shortly after that, we see David go out and challenge Goliath and kill Goliath in the valley of Elah. He's promoted and made a commander of a squad of men, and he leads his men into battle. And he's successful in everything that he does. He ends up marrying Michal, Saul's daughter, for a strange bride price. We covered that a few weeks ago. And in everything that David has done, he's been successful. And in Saul's incredible jealousy, he's turned this around to the point now where not only does he want to kill David, and not only has he given up any pretense of killing David, he now thinks that David is trying to kill him. He's twisted his around so much his mind. He's projecting so much of his own self onto David, of what he would do in David's situation, that he is not accounting for the fact that David is made of completely different stuff than Saul. David has no desire to kill Saul. What's happened now is Saul's insanity has blossomed into full-blooded madness. Finding and ending David now is a holy quest for Saul. So we find ourselves, as we open up chapter 21, with David on the run and in desperate circumstances. How desperate, do you ask? Well, let's think about it. He can't go home to the king and his wife. He can't go to Bethlehem and seek refuge from his family. His best friend Jonathan would be killed if Saul thought he was helping David. And David is thoroughly and spectacularly alone. Alone and unarmed, David is vulnerable. Let's pick it up in chapter 21, starting with verse 1. It says, David went to the town of Nob to see Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. "Why are you alone?" he asked. "Why is no one with you?" "The king has sent me on a private matter," David said. "He told me not to tell anyone why I'm here. I have told my men where to meet me later. Now what is there to eat? Give me 5 loaves of bread or anything else you have." "We don't have any regular bread," the priest replied, "but there is the holy bread, which you can have if your young men have not slept with any women recently." "Don't worry," David replied. "I never allow my men to be with women when we are on a campaign. And since they stay clean even on ordinary trips, how much more on this one?" Since there was no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of the presence that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. Now Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman, was there that day, having been detained before the Lord. David asked Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or a sword?" The king's business was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab a weapon. "I only have the sword of Goliath the Philistine, who you killed in the valley of Elah," the priest replied. "It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take it if you want it, for there is nothing else here." "There is nothing like it," David replied. "Give it to me." Well, we open up chapter 21 and we see David in desperate circumstances. And on the one hand, what we see makes a ton of sense. Well, on both hands, it makes a ton of sense. It's just not what we always hope from our biblical heroes. David does what we tend to do when we are desperate. And he does the right thing. He runs to God. Nob is a village of priests, and he goes to Nob to basically to inquire of the Lord and to seek some refuge from the priests there. But notice he doesn't tell them what's really going on. He doesn't share what's really happening. Instead, he comes up with this elaborate story. We'll call it a story, not a lie. He comes up with this elaborate lie about this secret mission that he's on, and his men are waiting for him, and none of it's true. There are no men waiting for David. David is all by himself. He's alone, he's unarmed, he's on the run, and he's desperate. So he's making up lies just out of whole cloth for the priest so that he can get some food and some weaponry. And this is going to come back and bite David later on. We have to ask ourselves the question, though, when we see David in this circumstance, of how is David a man after God's own heart when he lies in the face of the priest, right to the face of the priest, Ahimelech, and doesn't come out and tell the truth? Had he come out and told the truth, what would have happened? Well, we don't know. We don't know if Ahimelech would have turned him away, if he would have told Saul that David was there, if he would have tried to detain David. We're not sure what Ahimelech and the priest would have done. We just know what happened in the end. Ooh, that's called a tease. I'll get to that one in a little bit. But it looks, by all appearances, that David started in the right direction, but when he gets there, he's relying on his own strength, his own resourcefulness, his own craftiness to try and supply himself, to provide for his needs. But we've all been in desperate circumstances, and the question is, how do we respond in the midst of those circumstances? How do we respond in the midst of those circumstances? The following is a testimony given at Emmanuel Reformed Church in Paramount, California. My name is Penny, and I'm a single mother of 5 children. 3 years ago, when my youngest child was a year old, a succession of events destroyed the life I had known. But through God's grace, I was given the life I have now. I was in a relationship with someone for 10 years, and I felt like my life was good. He had a decent job, I was off welfare, and my world was in an upswing. Then my boyfriend fell back into his drug addiction, and it took over his life, leaving me to support my 5 kids alone. My apartment building was sold, and I was forced to move. The only place for me and the kids to go was a motel. I made $324 a week and had to pay $343 in rent. So even though I worked 40 hours a week, I began cleaning rooms in the middle of the night at the motel. The $3 I made for cleaning each room helped to feed the kids during the week. My 2 older children had been attending this church's junior high ministry, and they finally convinced me to come to church on a Sunday. I really enjoyed it, and God started speaking to me. But my life became overwhelming. It was so hard to see my children suffering because of me. I just couldn't take care of them like a mother should. One night, I parked in front of the church and cried. I asked God, why was I given these children if I'm unable to take care of them? They were hungry, unhappy, and living in a one-room motel. They were suffering because of my inability. I was trying to fix things, but it wasn't working. So I asked God if I should turn them over to the state. I cried for about 2 hours that night, but I got no answer. I went back to the motel and kept going. After a few more weeks, I was falling deeper and deeper into a hole I couldn't get out of. One day after work, I was at the end of my rope. There was barely anything to feed the kids. They were arguing with each other. I had a stressful day at work, and I had to work all night cleaning rooms. There was no one to help. So I sat down at the tiny table in the room, closed my eyes, and I prayed. I asked God for strength. I told him I didn't need money to miraculously fall from the sky, but I just needed endurance through this trial. I asked him to give my children peace and to give me a sign that I was going to make it. After I prayed, I lifted my head and took a deep breath. Right at that moment, there was a knock at my motel door. There were two people from a care team at church. They were holding a cup filled with candy. I cried. I still don't know who those people were. There were still some hard times after that, but God gave me strength to find a new life. I joined a small group and became part of that wonderful family. Now God has moved me to a great place to live, 2 blocks from church. He brought me a promotion at work, so I don't have to clean motel rooms at night anymore. I remember so clearly the feelings of helplessness and saying, if I could just make it through today. But our God is faithful. I look at my cup every day now. I keep it in my car as a reminder that when we as people are at our lowest, helpless and broken, if we just turn to God, He will bring us a cup. Sorry, I had to grab a Kleenex. Well, for 10 years, David is going to live on the run from King Saul, living in caves and holes in the ground before he is crowned king. Like the Chilean miners, this time will be instrumental in shaping the David that comes out the other side. So Ahimelech gives him the bread of the presence that only the priests were allowed to eat once it was replaced with new bread. And this is the act that Jesus quotes when his followers were picking grain heads on the Sabbath. The point Jesus makes is that there are times that human need supersedes ceremony and tradition. It could be very well that your times of desperation are preparing you for the next step God has for you. They're making you into the type of person that God can work with. I know those aren't always comforting words to hear, but the more I see and the more I live in this life, the more I come to believe that this is true. That it's the hard times that make us the people that we are. It's the difficult times that God uses to shape us and mold us. And how we respond in those difficult times says a lot about the character of our soul. So David leaves Ahimelech, armed with his sword and his bread, and he goes to King Achish in Gath. Now, where have we heard of Gath before? Oh yeah, Goliath's hometown. This is Goliath's hometown. Pretty sure everybody in Gath knows who David is. So his going to Gath is not a big shocker there. It's no big surprise. And the King Achish's officers are not pleased that David's shown up. They even sing his little song. Isn't this the David that they sing about? Saul killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands. Philistines, killed us, killed our people. Do we really want this guy here in our town? He's literally the nemesis of the Philistine people. And so they get up in King Achish's grill here a little bit, and you have to understand the dynamic that was going on. It was not unusual in those days for someone, especially a high-ranking or a very important person in one kingdom, to fall out of favor with the king and to flee that land and to go to the land of that king's enemy. Because surely he's not so desperate that he's going to launch an invasion into another country just to get back one guy. That's how the thinking goes. And so David goes to the land of the Philistines for protection, which seems like kind of an oxymoron somehow. But he goes there for protection. So why would David flee Saul and head into Philistine territory where he's pretty well reviled? Respected, but reviled. Well, because he's not safe anywhere in Israel. Whenever Saul hears that David's popped up or shown his head, he shows up with his soldiers looking to kill him. David must be thinking, surely Saul won't hunt for me here in Gath. It's kind of like what happened with Edward Snowden when he blew the whistle on the NSA. He went to Russia. He went to our nation's geopolitical enemy. Because they were making a fine home for him there. And the same way King Achish is making a home for David amongst his people. But this begins to worry David, because if King Achish sees him as a threat, sees him as who he really is, as the future king of Israel, he may abuse him or use him as a bargaining chip with Saul. So instead of acting like a threat, David acts crazy, and he drools down his beard all the time, and he marks on door frames, it says, and he basically acts insane, and it works. David ends up fleeing Gath and ends up in the cave of Adullam a few miles away. But there's this great line in here where the King Achish, replies that he has enough madmen in his kingdom. Why bring him another? And he gives this great line. He says, why should I let someone like this be my guest? This becomes more about Achish having David and Saul not. And David doesn't want to get caught up in the politics, so he makes himself a non-threat by pretending madness. Don't you wish you could just feign madness once in a while to get out of uncomfortable situations? I don't think it works like that, really. But it worked for David. But Achish asks a great question, though, and I think about why I should let someone like this be my guest. Because to be the guest of someone in the Middle East, in that culture, means that you afforded them food, you fed them, and you provided them shelter, and you provided them protection from their enemies, if their enemies pursued them up to your place, your house, your castle, your country, whatever yours might be. So he asked the question, why should I let someone like this be my guest? In other words, why should I let a madman be my friend, enjoy my food and my protection? Jesus answers the question of King Achish 1,000 years later when he welcomes the outcast, the thrown away, the social leper into his fellowship meal. Jesus says that the reason that we have guests that make us a little uncomfortable is that when we receive them, we are receiving him. Think about that when we have guests that make us just a little uncomfortable, what we're really doing is we're receiving Jesus, not really receiving the other person as our guest. Before her death in January of 2020, Kathy Boone had been living on the streets for years, struggling with drug abuse and mental illness. But for her father, Jack Spithill, he said the tragedy was multiplied tenfold by the revelation that she died without collecting any of the inheritance she was due after her mother's death, an amount that totaled over $900,000. Her father said, it just didn't make any sense to me. That money was just sitting there and she needed help in the worst way. I think my failure to recognize her mental health issues, I kind of gave up on her because of the drugs, and I shouldn't have done that. Spithill said that after he lost touch with Boone, he was unsure if she even knew that she was entitled to an inheritance, or if so, how to go about collecting. Court records say that after her mother died, estate representatives tried to contact Boone via phone and email, spoke to other family members and sent her messages via Facebook, and even ran ads in the newspaper. To no effect. They even hired a private investigator, but came up empty. That Boone was entitled to any sort of money was news to those who knew her best. She was a special person as far as I'm concerned, said Danny Holder, a friend who shared cigarettes and coffee with Boone at the local McDonald's. She was a sweetheart. I fell in love with her. Local public guardian Chris Rosen says Boone might have gotten help if the court could have established her inability to care for herself, but added, it's a steep benchmark to clear without criminal charges or urgent medical needs. Jonathan Cavale, another friend with similar struggles, said, we're not just statistics. These are good folks. It's just circumstances. Why do we draw the lines that withhold friendship and withhold friendship from Christ, from those that we are around, from people that aren't like us? We tend to withhold fellowship and friendship from people that aren't like us, people that make us uncomfortable. We like to be in our own little niches and our own little cliques. But we miss out when we only see what is wrong, when we only see what is broken. We miss out on the Jesus in the other person. How can we look past those things that make us uncomfortable? How can we look past those things that raise our hackles and look deeper? Like this Kathy Boone's father couldn't look past her drug abuse to see the deeper mental health issues there, and he regretted it. Can we look past people's behaviors? Can we look past people's appearances and embrace the Jesus Christ that we see in them? That's the question. And now the rest of the story. Doeg the Edomite, it says, was detained before the Lord, and Bible scholars don't know what that means. They have no explanation for it, other than to me it sounds like he was in detention somehow. He'd been detained there at Nob, and he spots David, and he goes back and he reports to Saul. This happens in chapter 22. He reports to Saul that David was at Nob with Ahimelech, and so Saul goes to Nob with all of his soldiers, And he asked his men to kill Ahimelech and all the priests for colluding with David, even though all that he did was what he thought was the king's will. He was giving David a sword and some bread because David was on a special mission. But his men won't kill the priests, so he has Doeg the Edomite do it. And Doeg does it completely. He kills everybody. He kills 70 plus people in the village. He kills all the children. He kills the women. He kills the livestock. He obliterates the village of Nob from the face of the earth. It's just he misses one guy. Abiathar the priest grabs the ephod and he takes off and he flees and he finds David and joins up with David and will be instrumental in David's journey over the next decade. But this event has a backfiring to it. Abiathar goes and tells David everything that's happened, and David grieves that he caused Ahimelech and the priests of Nob such hardship and such murder. And he grieves for them. But what's interesting is Saul's plan backfires, and out of the woodwork, people start coming to David. First, Abiathar the priest, and then other men who were pursued. It says men that were in trouble, that were fleeing from Saul, men that were in debt. They come from all over, and about 400 men join David in the cave of Adullam. And he starts his little band of mighty men. Well, perhaps today you're feeling a bit desperate that you need God to give you answers, and thus far he hasn't. That you're scrambling like David to make sense of what is happening and where it all went wrong. God led David through the dark times. And it's David who writes the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. David had to live that before he could write it. And he does. In his deep, dark down. God is leading you through these times as well. And hindsight will show you one day, but for now, like David, you have to trust in who God is and what he's done for you in the past. The two things that I really pulled out of this scripture this morning was that David was burdened with a sense of desperation. He was on the run, he was desperate, and his desperation drove him to the Lord. It drove him to do some other things that were not as great, but it drove him to the Lord. And the other thing is the question of King Achish. Why should I let someone like this be a guest in my house? The question that Jesus answers for us. I hope you have a wonderful Lord's Day. I hope this has blessed you. I love you. God loves you. Have a wonderful day. Take care.